Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Social Innovation Conference, SICON 2020. My name is Nazia Ahmed. I'm the director of the Social Outcomes Lab. We have a really amazing session today. I'm so excited and definitely starstruck. We will be talking to Matt NOFFS, who's the CEO of the TED NOFFS Foundation and also the co-founder of Street Universities. Hello, Matt. Thank you for joining.
Hi, Nazia. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. So before I launch into our very riveting and amazing conversation with Matt today, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement to country. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the Daru people as the traditional owners of the land that I'm zooming in from today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where Matt and our esteemed viewers are watching from today as well. I'd like to acknowledge the very rich history and culture and wisdom of Aboriginal people and pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging. And particularly as a second generation migrant, I'm particularly grateful to the traditional owners of Australia, of our land. I'd also like to acknowledge that our Aboriginal brothers and sisters have endured a lot of pain and trauma, and that there are significant gaps between the social outcomes for Aboriginal people versus the rest of the population. And I'd just like to share my commitment to working together with everyone to do what we can to make sure that we all have a really good future together, and that those gaps are reduced and hopefully no longer present. So thank you so much, everyone, again for joining us today. Hello and welcome, Matt. How are you today?
Good, thank you. And that was a really a beautiful acknowledgement. I think that was one of the most not only compassionate but understanding acknowledgements I've ever heard of Indigenous people in Australia. And I find acknowledgements and welcome to country can be difficult to bear because they can sometimes be tokenistic. We can have leaders who don't really mean it, and I really appreciate how deeply you went into that and how much you explained it, the hurt, the trauma, and your willingness and your work to help. I think that's really important because it is something that needs to be beyond words, and I really thank you for that.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt. Yeah, it's a really big deal, right? It's a really big deal to all of us. So thank you so much for that. I'm gonna do like a really brief bio, but I'm gonna talk to you and ask you questions about your background. So as I'd mentioned, so Matt is the CEO of the TED NOFFS Foundation. He is also the co-founder of Street Universities. He's written a couple of really amazing books on the topic of drug and alcohol, and particularly will make reference to one of his books, which I really love, called Addicted Today. So Matt is the grandson of Reverend TED NOFFS, who is basically, I think, it's a known fact, he's a pioneer of social welfare in this country. And it's such an honor. It's such an honor to be talking to you, Matt, for your own accomplishments, your contributions to society, but also the fact that you're directly linked to TED NOFFS, who's done such amazing work as well. It's for me, I was starstruck the first time I met you, and I am every time, in the sense that there's so much to learn from you, and this kind of talking to someone who's coming from a family where doing social work is just, it's a part of what you do, and you've been doing it for generations. I think all of us will learn so much from you, and I know that our viewers will get a lot out of talking to you today. So thank you again. And I'm going to start by asking you some questions, right? So tell me about the Social Innovation Conferences. It isn't just about the social innovations. It's about the change maker, the person themselves, and us feeling inspired and learning from them. So I want you to tell me a little bit about Matt NOFFS, who you are, the person, and what's kind of brought you on the path that you are on today.
Well, I'd start by saying that that I don't believe in any sense in the idea of the special person, and this is something that my wife Naomi constantly reminds me. I think it's one of her quotes, that there's no such thing as extraordinary people, but ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and that's difficult to acknowledge if you're happy doing whatever you're doing. It's uncomfortable if you don't want to push yourself to go out and do things. But I would hate to think that all of the things that you just listed there that had to do with me or with Ted, and people who are, you know, labelled with these ideas of even a specialness, I'd hate for people to think that it has something to do with a natural, either a bloodline or gifts or any of these things. It's simply not. It's simply not the case. In that my grandfather taught me that my last name or being related to him had nothing to do with giving, doing, creating in this world. That those were things that were up to me, were up to you, were up to all of us. And his work began as a young minister in the outback. He actually started out as a car mechanic, funnily enough, and from his family at all. And he struggled a few times to get through what we consider the HSC today. Became a car mechanic and watched a film on I think it was called Stairway to Heaven or something, or maybe I'm mixing up the Led Zeppelin song. But he watched this film, and I think he was on a date with my nan at the time. And he walked out of the cinema and said to my nan, "I want to become a minister." And it really disappointed his family. He thought he'd struggled to get a job as a car mechanic, and so, but he went off to do that. Some of his first postings were in outback New South Wales, Indigenous communities like Wilcannia, where he started to realise the plight of Indigenous people in Australia, started to work to try and support them in any way he could, and he started coming up against resistance against that even then. Then he worked in Sydney. He started to come up against resistance in his own church, and it was around his late 30s when he took up the position of being the minister at a very tiny kind of room in the middle of King's Cross, which he renamed the Wayside Chapel. And there was a congregation of 5 elderly people there. My nan says, I think all but one who left within a week after hearing his sermons. They just weren't interested. And he probably had some interesting ideas then, but still quite tied to the idea that Jesus was a God and that Christianity was the only way. And to cut a long story short, he opened up the doors. Him and my nan opened up the doors in King's Cross to the bikies. Were some of the first bikies in the 50s. Were some of the first young people who walked through the doors, and really feeling what he felt, that it was important to were there instead of trying to just do what a lot of his colleagues were doing at the time, which was kind of preaching to the converted to some extent. And to cut a long story, many years later, it became like the largest, basically, youth centre in the Southern Hemisphere, with them seeing around 3,000 young people a week, in one place. And at this stage, my nan says it was around this point where they realised that they were the ones who were converted. And I'll come back to that. But during these early years, he met a young Charlie Perkins, and Charlie said that he was actually kind of, facing issues around criminality and so on. But Ted helped him Ted was quite a bit older than him. I think, I'm not sure how many years, nearly 10 years older, but got him. They started working together using those kind of that rebellious energy, and they orchestrated the Freedom Ride. And a lot of that history is on the IATSIS website and so on. You can go and look at that. And that became that Aboriginal Affairs Foundation. The government took on a lot of those programs, departments, and so on. Indigenous people to be considered human in the eyes of the law. And a few years later, he started, it was about 3 a.m. where he came up with the idea with a guy called Sir Alan Walker for the idea of Lifeline. But Ted walked away from that too, believing that there was a dispute around whether people should submit their soul to Christ before getting help. And at this stage, this really started grating against Ted's ideas of... and cut forward another 10 years, Ted started seeing that perhaps Jesus was not a God, but an incredible human being who helped to heal people in different ways, love your neighbor, take care of each other, and so on. But then he looked over and saw in Buddhism, he saw in Islam, he saw in Sikh communities, he saw even in people who are agnostic, in atheism, that there was still a love of humanity in all those different faiths and none, and that all of them were just as important as each other.
That's absolutely gorgeous.
Well, and his actual creed, which was called the Family of Humanity, went like this: I'm a Protestant, but I'm also a Catholic. I am a Jew, but I'm also Muslim, a Buddhist, but I'm also a Sikh. I'm agnostic, but I'm also atheist, because first and foremost, I am a human being, and no one in this world is a stranger to me. And he meant that. He meant that literally, and he really believed that to the core of his being, and that affected me greatly, even as a boy around 7 or 8, when he'd take me around King's Cross and introduce me to people. I had no concept of what a normal person was, and to this day still don't. And so so he did those things. My parents took on his work when he passed away, renamed the Wayside Foundation Ted NOFFS Foundation, and worked to bring the science into it, worked with the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre at UNSW, and developed first treatment programs for adolescents, residential treatment, I should say, and so a lot of that work continued to about it is, where my grandparents looked one way towards spirituality in the community, my parents looked the other way towards science. And I try to think that today we try and bring those two ways of looking at the world together, that we need spirituality and science, we need the community to be involved, and we need the best professionals that we can employ to work with young people. And that's what we do today. It's how we develop the street universities. It's how we go to push for the pill testing pilots in Canberra. It's all about working with community. It's all about having the best science available, and it's about people doing the best they can in really tough circumstances, whether it's COVID or whether it's trying to get a pill testing pilot up when there's so much political resistance. So yeah.
So, and that's really amazing. So I think, part of what I see in you is that you're a very determined person, and you're very clear in your thinking and your ideas. And and you're not afraid to express what you think is right, and no matter kind of what obstacles you come across. That's sort of how I perceive you. So tell me, Matt, at what point did you sort of think that, okay, that you wanted to continue, the work of your grandfather and your parents? Did you have sort of an epiphany as well, or did you have points where you thought, oh, I'd like to just go and do something else? I mean, what drew you to continue doing what you're doing?
Well, Ted influenced me. Ted loved writing poetry and writing books as well, and he self-published a whole lot of books in his lifetime, and he loved writing poetry, and he taught his own sons to be creative. That Dad loved, still does love painting. Both my other uncles love making music, and so one of the things that we learned also, that it was important to express yourself creatively, which is the basis of the Street University as well, which comes from their work at the Wayside. But from a very young age, I just held up my grandfather as a hero. And I was saying to someone the other day that I thought that was a normal thing. I thought that everyone just kind of went, let's, follow in your grandparents' footsteps. I only realized that only very recently that might have been a weird thing. I love that, and I adore my parents and that. But I love doing those things on the side too. I love making music. Even for my own kids, I love helping see young people make their own music. I love writing, whether it's writing books or writing kids books or whatever it is. So I think being creative on the side of all those things is really important. And Philip Adams, who was someone who I spent a long time with when I was in my early 20s, really taught me that idea. And I think it's very much the same for the latest generation of young Australians. Are you really ever going to be one thing your whole life? I mean, school still teaches us to be one thing for our whole life. What a ridiculous notion. And I struggled with that in my early 20s. I thought maybe I need to be one thing. But I think I realized that was a furphy. And I certainly tell that to my daughters, that it's highly unlikely that they're just going to be one thing. Even if they're a teacher, they're still going to want to do other things. And I think that's really important. So I followed in my parents and my grandparents' footsteps, but I also, did other things a few other different ways as well. And when did I first realize I wanted to do that? Probably at a very young age, probably around that five or six or something, just because I love my grandfather so much. And yeah.
That's amazing. And yeah, agree with you 100%. It's crazy to think that given all the opportunities that we have today, that we would only do one thing, right? With all the technology and the ability to kind of, get education at any point, all sorts of different things that we can do. I love all the LinkedIn bios where people kind of have like 5 or 6 things that they list about themselves. I always think it's really cool, and it's much more sort of honest. So Matt, tell me about the work that you do at the NOFFS Foundation and at Street Universities.
So our work at NOFFS Foundation is primarily based on helping young people with problems. The age group that we work with is around 12 to 25, although often, we'll see a young person a person who's a bit older than 25. So primarily it's young people who have problems with drug and alcohol, mental health issues, homelessness, and the way that we work is we run homelessness services. We run residential drug and alcohol treatment. Parents started in the 90s, and we also run the street universities, which Naomi and I started 2007, I think. And the street universities are in a way, they're non-residential health services, drug and alcohol, mental health, and so on. But they're also a space for young people to kind of realise their own innate capacity beyond that. And it very much harks back to my grandparents' work at the Wayside Chapel on creating those spaces. So dating that work, and today we just within the organisation launched a model 3.0, which we've developed new ideas around how the street universities work. We try and get everyone collaborating with that and poking holes in it as much as possible. Already, I think by the end of the day, we'll have 3.1 because so many holes were poked in the model. Specifically my parts, they're always poking holes in my parts. Whatever I come up with, they're like, no, that's not good enough. And I encourage that because again, it's not just my idea. We're stealing ideas from my grandparents and so on. And love it when we go to employ. Today, one of our managers said they went to employ someone, a social worker, who said he'd been stealing ideas from us for his own services for 7 years or something. We love that. Sharing ideas and stealing ideas, improving them, and so on. So that's the work that we do today. And then we also run an advocacy campaign called Take Control with people like Mick Palmer, who was a former federal police commissioner, where we campaign for safer, saner drug laws. And it was through that we campaigned to get pill testing done with Pill Testing Australia and Harm Reduction Australia a couple of years ago now, I think, in Canberra. 2018 was the first time we did the first pilot, I think.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. So I know that Tony, you've put your hand up. If it's cool, send your question through in the chat box, and we'll get to it shortly. So I want to ask you about addiction. So today we're talking about the destigmatization of addiction and why it's important. I was wondering if you could sort of start telling us a little bit about about what addiction is, and kind of the link to trauma and addiction, and why also it's important for us to all kind of have a bit of an understanding of addiction on the pathway to getting to the point of destigmatizing.
Look, I think that it's very clear that addiction is something that has always been seen as a negative problem to have in society, and the reason why that sort of stigma hurts people is because one of the things that we don't do is, if a young person's in drug treatment, we even if they are okay with to be shown on TV, and when I go back and I look at, it used to just happen all the time. Then we went through a period in the 90s where you'd fuzz and you make their voice sound like that and sound all scary. And I think we've done a lot of work over the last 10 years to really kind of stop that happening. And I think it's affected, it's hard to see things that do that anymore, even on, current affairs and so on. People are becoming much more aware of that because it's hard for that person to get a job. Obviously, if you're fuzzed out their face and all the rest of it, not. But if a young person has a drug and alcohol problem, that sort of addiction, or any sort of addiction that we've kind of painted negatively, it's problematic for them. And the stigma, so the stigma can hurt them in kind of simple ways like that. It's hard to get a job and so on. But also it's unfair. The the more we started looking into it, the more Kieran and I wanted to write a book about it, and other people were interested in it as well. And at the time, Johan Hari overseas with Chasing the Scream started really pushing this idea that addiction was the opposite of connection. And I thought, I wonder if that's true. And a part of me went, I think it's partly true. And then I saw other people saying, oh, it's this, it's that, it's just trauma, and it's poverty and so on. So Kieran and I kind of went into writing the book and looking at it because we were pretty confident we knew what it was. And as we got halfway through it, we went, it's not what we think it is at all. And some of the latest science and research around addiction came out as we went to publish. And that research showed that addiction was fundamentally not negative, and it could be largely positive, but mostly neutral. That is, it's something that is a part of just being a human being. That falling in love with a person is, the brain operates in the same way as when you're falling in love with a drug like ice or heroin. Mentally, addiction is, as Shakespeare, who coined the term, kind of suggested, that it was an obsession. And so when you look at it like that, it is the way that the brain works is it helps humans, and I would dare say from looking at the mammals, to hunt for something, to want something, to desire something, and to go after it, and to get up in the morning, to go to go to work, to fall in love with a human being, to take care of your family, to have children, to paint a painting, write a book, to inject heroin, to take ecstasy at a festival, pornography, to read a book, to plant a plant. All of these things are instigated by obsession, or that desiring, that very notion of wanting. That is addiction. So when you look at it like that, it's something that is a part of all of us and cannot be just problematic and negative. But it then did beg the question, what was a problematic addiction? And in the book, we write about a person who, there's a chapter that was called Heroin Saved My Life. And that really confronted me with some deep questions around, it was about a doctor, and it was a doctor and a lawyer who lost his license to practice medicine, and spent years using heroin. But the chapter was called Heroin Saved My Life. And that really started kind of getting me to question the notion of a problematic addiction. Something like heroin, I asked them recently, do you think, could injecting heroin ever be good for someone? And of course, all of these things beg deeper questions about what good and bad is in the first place. Again, Shakespeare, who decided individually what good and bad was. And of course, there are things that we share. You could say most of humanity all agree that, say, killing people is bad and can never be good. But fundamentally, when you get down to heroin, again, you would say that maybe in Australian society, most people might say that's bad. But when you dig deeper and further still, if I ask questions, what if they said, like this man, it was keeping them alive, and helping them see it from that point of view might change their mind about, say, prescribing heroin to someone. Or what is it about the heroin, injecting heroin, that's bad? They might say, oh, the injecting. Okay, all right, interesting. Okay, what happens if a doctor injected them? Well, yes, I suppose having it, yes, but what I'm saying is they might die without it because they might not want to live, for instance, and so on. And so problematic addiction, all of us harbour, very black and white views about it. But actually the reality is even a problematic addiction is grey. But there are some things that we can mostly agree which are bad, and that is something that is just continuing to harm you every day. And so that might be the heroin addiction. Injecting heroin every day with a shared needle that's a dirty needle is it's hard. It then becomes hard to frame that as good in any way. So then there is such a thing as what I'd refer to as a problematic addiction. I'm trying not to use the word bad, but problematic addiction. And that stirred up some interesting questions. How does that begin? And of course, there's not a single reason. Is it just no? But connection is certainly a part of it. Is it because someone's poor? Well, often, yes, but not always. Is it because someone's been traumatized, especially when they were a child or at an earlier stage in life? Yeah, quite frequently. And we found that trauma, and this is no surprise to people in the field, that trauma is the protagonist when it comes to a problematic addiction. But again, it isn't always the predictor of a problematic addiction. And so we're still learning about that, but it's safe enough to say that trauma certainly informs a problematic addiction. But it's important we take a step back from all of that, all of those perspectives and labels, and say every one of us is addicted to something, at least one thing. I mean, I think I'd find it impossible to find a human being who wasn't addicted to something, whether it's work or reading books or drugs. You know, addiction is just a part of being. So if we're going to label these things, let's label it properly and let's say, well, that's a problematic addiction. All right, well, that's a problematic addiction. But let's also understand why and how that came about before we just assume that person has made a bad choice. Because that's what happens when we dig deep under all of this stuff. That stigma that you first referred to has everything to do with the assumption deep down. Even the most enlightened of us who understand all this stuff, you dig down deep enough, down there, that just suggests that person has made a bad choice somewhere along the line, or is making bad choices every day. And that's just not true. If that's the case, well, then all of us are making bad choices, and we often do, frequently. So addiction is something that's human. It isn't always negative. It's often very positive, but it's commonly neutral. And addictions can be problematic, absolutely, without a doubt. Often informed by trauma, but not always. And hardly ever, I would say never, informed simply by bad choices.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Matt. I think that notion of, and you know, the fact that addiction just is, right? You were saying that to me the other day, that it just is. It's not good or bad. It's just something that's a part of human behavior, and I think that's a really beautiful thing, because I think, working in the I guess with marginalized communities myself, not as directly being an economist, kind of more in the background, but certainly we're working communities and with people with all sorts of challenges and issues as well. I think one thing that really stops progress is the judgment that they receive, that people receive from others. And certainly it would be, humanity and society would be far more beautiful if we all sort of try to understand one another more, and kind of remove those perceptions around as you were saying, bad choices. And sometimes it's people having that perception of themselves as well. So beating themselves up over a negatively associated addiction, and constantly sort of going, well, I made some bad choices and this is, why this has happened to me, or whatever else. The next thing I wanted to kind of ask you is, why is it important for us to not have, why is it important for us to destroy this kind of stigma associated with addiction? And you've talked about it for sure, but also kind of in the context of the space that we're in at the moment. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and that's going to give rise to a lot of issues, I think. So I was wondering if you could talk about sort of some of the emerging challenges that we might have, and why this kind of work towards destigmatizing addiction and our perceptions of it continues to be important.
So if you come back to that notion of trauma, I think many of us are experiencing trauma on very subtle levels at the moment. Social distancing, not being able to hug loved ones, being assaulted with the headlines every day. You said it yourself in the conference already, just uncertainty. Uncertainty is really difficult for human beings. And then you can get to deeper levels of trauma. What Victorians are going through at the moment is absolutely traumatic. There's no way around that. And then you go even further, and you see what's happening in the US and so on. But if that's the case, if we are being traumatized at the moment, then the reality is that there will be repercussions. And there are ways of mitigating that right now, and some of the ways that we do that, Kieran talked about in our book Addicted, about Van der Kerk's work in the US, and the ability to move through trauma, walking, exercising, and so on. I think that's really important. And some of these government ads are already doing their bit in terms of reminding us to do that. But it's good for people to remember how important physical activity is. The reality is, Nazia, is that we will come out of this with a certain level of trauma, and therefore a certain level of problematic addictions as well. Those who are already who were suffering before COVID will probably suffer in worse ways, and therefore their addiction become more problematic. For some people who might not have had a problematic addiction, they might now have one. They might be drinking more. If a day is difficult for us, we might find ourselves having an extra beer. People are bored during the day. They have, more access to screens, to pornography, and not that a screen is just harmful in itself, but there is a certain level of escaping from ourselves, which is normal, but there is also a depth of harm that can come along with that, and not being able to be present and live here to deal with reality. And so I do think there will be an increase of addiction that's basically, comes from a deeper level of trauma that most of us, if not all of us, will experience. Have over the last, 5 months now? Is it 5 months? About 5 months.
Yep, something like that. Feels like 5 years.
In the coming months. Oh, no. Yeah. I know, and in the coming months. So I think that's what we're going to be doing. The easiest way to think about it, as the economy goes down, then trauma and addictions will rise. And but it's important that we know how to that there are ways of dealing with that right now. And I'd say to people, that daily walk, going for a walk, is really important. And that physical activity is just as important as talking to a counsellor or your neighbour or a relative. So there's the social isolation, but also the physicality is really important at the moment. Getting out. Naomi said that Andrews and in Victoria would have been better, instead of to say you've limited to 1 hour a day outside, that everyone gets out for 1 hour, even if it's 1 hour only, and says, no, that's it, but you've still got to get out. To some extent she's joking, but to another extent she's being serious, that really people need to be staying active for their mental health as well as their physical health.
Yeah, brilliant. No, that's very sound advice. And Naomi, your wife, right, sounds sounds like a very clever lady. So Matt, because we're talking about destigmatization, what's the approach? How can each of us in our own lives, or the people that we kind of that we work with or hang out with, how can we go on this path of changing our perceptions and thinking about addiction differently?
I think reflecting on your own addictions is a good start. Thinking about the things that you truly desire. When you sit still and quiet your mind, you can reflect on the things that you're desiring. A TV show, a packet of chips, to go for a walk, to write something, to write an email to someone. This is the parts of our brain which the beginnings of addiction. So I think it's important to remember that that's a part of all of us, that desire. And one of the other really important things is to realize that that we're all still evolving. We're not in this kind of fixed state of human evolution, of human development. We're all still evolving. We're still learning how to do this. So even this notion of addiction is not final, and we're all developing and evolving together. And I think it's important to remember that none of us are perfect. That making mistakes is very much a part of being human, and that we need to accept that part of ourselves. I think sometimes when we feel very judgmental towards other people, we're often experiencing that judgment internally as well. It's good to recognize that, Now there's something that you pointed out, and you've got to remind me, because you got me the other day talking about masks in terms of human development in the book. What did I write about in the book when I saw masks? Because I know what I think about masks, but I can't remember what I wrote.
I haven't actually. I wanted to read something out.
Okay.
So this is Matt's amazing book, Addicted, and so I'm going to read out page 103, right? So the trauma survivors I've worked with in my career often have great difficulty in trusting others. Their boundaries have been regularly broken or dismissed, and their conception of trust has become linked with danger. They struggle not only how to trust, but with who to trust. The rest of us often see a very wary, very guarded version of the person. We may see the tough exterior, the protective armor the individual has fought for years to build up. We may see their anger, aggression, sadness, or hysteria. We may see a calm ocean one moment and an emotional tidal wave the next. What we are usually seeing, however, is a mask, a version of a person who is so affected by their life circumstances that they simply never feel safe enough to completely let go. It can be this unpredictable, inconsistent, and often self-sabotaging style of behavior that clouds our ability to see the person behind the mask. We see what lies on the surface and conclude that this person is aggressive or depressed or mad. We see a person whose addiction is clearly making matters worse, drawing them into debt, more crime, more health risks, more isolation, and yet they continue. So, you talk about, someone working so hard,
so
people working.
That I was gonna say, you know what? I wish I could take credit for that, but Kieran wrote that. And I know that because it sounds really. That's that definitely that would be Kieran's one of Kieran's chapters. But it's very true, and so he's talking about that as a psychologist. And I'm pretty sure it is anyway. What's the name of that chapter?
The name of the chapter is, it's pain, part 2, pain. Subsection.
Yeah, no, that's Kieran's. So that's Kieran's, and he's absolutely right. And one of the things that we talk about, and you wanted to talk about, was masks. And I'm not going to talk to Kieran's chapter because I think you just said it yourself. It's also how we judge people from the outside. But some of the work that I do with another psychologist from Harvard, Dr. Susan Cook-Reuter, is all around masks, and again goes back to this notion of adult development, and that we're always those masks are actually things that we develop into. And so Suzanne's work looks at the beginnings of adult development, and that is the child when it's born screams for milk, or when it's in pain or has wet itself and wants the nappy changed or something like that. It's how it deals with life. It screams and it gets what it wants. Now, most of us grow out of that. It's called a mask, or the phase of opportunity, the opportunist. And a lot of the kids we work with remain in that, with that mask on, that if they might, if they see you in a back alley, they might hold you up, ask to mug you. And it's not because they're evil or they're bad. It's because they're still in that phase of it's me against the world. And we've all got to fight each other. We see that Trump acts like an opportunist still. I've got to win, because if I don't win, I lose. And if I lose, I die. And that is very much the mentality of an opportunist. There are phases, and there are masks after the opportunist, the diplomat, where the rules of the group apply, the mask of the expert, where as an academic, I have to be right, and if I'm not right, I die an academic death. So I can't be wrong. As the achiever, trying new things, being open to feedback, and so on. But addiction is, like Kieran points out, very much kind of linked in with that mask of the opportunist and survival. And all of us, we don't lose that aspect of ourselves. At the moment, have you ever noticed, it happens to boys mostly, but sometimes we'll be driving and you'll look at a guy driving in a car, and the guy will hit his accelerator and he screeches past you. He goes, he's trying to show you he's a man and you should be scared of him. Is he? What he's actually saying is he's scared. He's scared of the world. He's thinking of the world as me versus you. But have you ever been walking down the street, a group of kids are walking down, and one of them goes and spits on the sidewalk when they see you.
Yeah.
You know, it's a signal, right? And it's meant to be a signal to say, be afraid of me. What it's actually saying is, I'm scared. It's me versus the world. There's this huge world out there. Everything is a threat. Even, you know, the person who, like me, looks like a complete door. It's a constant protection. So that the masks that, you know, Kieran's are referring to are masks that we all wear. Right now, I'm talking to you through the mask of the expert. Okay, I've got to be right, Nazia. These are the things I'm talking about. This is my profession. This is my you know, my whole being is on the line here. You know, no, well, actually, it's my ego that's on the line, my professional ego, and I could experience shame if I say something the wrong way, or do something to make myself look like a fool, which I've done many times on TV as well, I have to say. And I like making jokes of that. But it is hard. It is hard too. Most people in the universe, well, maybe that's not true. Most people in the commercial universe, I should say, in the workplace, are wearing the mask of the expert. Have to be right, cannot be wrong. Are experts about everything, from whatever their degree is in to the best, right? Whose opinion is this and who they're listening to, and so on. So expertise is actually the one that most is the mask that most people wear. And the easiest way to feel compassion for someone who is kind of stuck, I should say, with the mask of the opportunist, is that is also a part of them. And where the opportunist is me versus the world, that's life and death. The easiest way to feel it is, you know, imagine, you know, feeling shame right now for doing something wrong or being wrong. And how do we evolve from that? Be open, be vulnerable, find the strength in being, you know, in vulnerability. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. So, okay, so I'm that's totally amazing. I just got a message. Far out. This is amazing. Thanks. So I'm conscious of the time. So please send through for people that are watching online now. Please feel free to send through your questions in the chat box. Now I'm having a slight problem with my monitor in that I can't see your comments at the moment, but I think Matt would be able to see them. So please do send them through in the comments box. So Matt, so I mean, it's really interesting. The other day you were talking about, you know, the mask of, you know, always having to be nice, and I think you were just saying that generically, but I think that's something that made me kind of reflect and analyze my own behaviors a bit, because I think I have that kind of a thing that I feel like I always need to be nice, and I don't know if that's then kind of, you know, become sort of a habit or if it's genuine or not. But the point is, it really got me thinking about what my own masks are. So what's the kind of course that people should take when they're thinking about what's a good way to start analyzing, you know, what masks you might be wearing?
So there's a really, I would go and study the work of people like Susan Cook-Reuter, and you can just do a quick search right now to have a look at those different phases and masks in her work. If you type into Google HBR for Harvard Business Review, HBR, and 7 transformations of leadership, and you can find the study there by Suzanne Cook-Reuter, Dr. Suzanne Cook-Reuter, and there are others, Keegan, Torbett, Wilbur. There's the whole kind of field out there around adult development, which moves on from the work of Piaget and others who looked at child development. So that's an academic way of studying it and looking at it. And it's actually got a really nice sample size as well. So it's some good science behind it. It's not just the kind of, you know, Matt's just pulling out some kind of airy fairy stuff. That's a place to start. But I can talk really generically and from a non-scientific point of view, and from my own experience, in that after the place of the how much time have we got left? We've got 5 minutes.
We've got 5 minutes. Yeah.
So after that first place is that place of the opportunist, and the way we feel compassion for that, for the guy who's roared past in his ute, you know, and you know, looks at you menacingly, is to remember he's scared. You know, remember that, and that he's stuck in that phase. Even feel compassion for Trump. It's hard. I find it so hard to feel compassion for Trump, but to do it is to realize he's stuck all the way back in that initial stage of have to win or I die. And so that's a pretty good motivator to want to win. If I don't win, I die. That's that. Moving on to the stage of diplomacy is the rules of the group, and that forms in school. You know, Matt's out of the gang, Nazia, so you have to say, you know, something about Matt's hair and how silly it looks, and you think to yourself, I don't want to say that, you know, but Sarah says, well, if you don't, you're out of the group. And so that's your level of perception. So, and we all go through that. Then it's this phase of the expert, where we've got to own our knowledge and expertise, or we feel threatened. And then we can start opening up to new places. And to answer your question, open to new ideas. So we talked about being nice the other day. One of the big things that change makers get caught in is this idea, and it is a little bit of a diplomacy feeling, that if I'm not nice to that person, Nazia might not talk to me again. And if not, I'm going to feel connected. I feel threatened. And so what I was saying to you the other day was one of the things, especially having a grandfather who was so loved, and one of the people who's listening here who knows all about this, Mark Radomski, he knows how to cause trouble, and he knows how to piss people off. And I'd say sometimes that's a really good thing if you're doing it with intention. Simply, I'd say about being nice for the change maker, which is that spare your niceness, spare your warmth for those who give you warmth back. When we dish it out to everyone, that's fine. If you are unlike me and you've got a reservoir of energy and love that goes on forever, like a Jesus or a Buddha, or a Muhammad. You know, if you have that, then that's fantastic. But most of us can't be all things to all people, and need to be aware of our. You talked about in the beginning determination and our commitment to ideas. Sometimes you're going to face someone who is absolutely against you. It might be a politician. It might be sometimes a person in your own field. You know, you need to be ready to just either ignore them and keep walking and doing your thing. And if you say to yourself, being nice, and part of my identity as a change maker and doing good things in the community is that I always have to be nice. Well, that I think there's not a huge harm, but there's a level of harm to walk away and save your warmth for people who give you that warmth back. It's a difficult one to process, but it's mostly, that's just one that change makers often get caught in, and people who've kind of helped me with that. I think it's something that I was saying to you as well, as a father of daughters, it's really important for women too. Sometimes women get caught in that mask of having to be nice all the time. You know, when simply there are sometimes where you should be able to tell someone to fuck off, you know, just to back off. And I think that's really important, to find sometimes it's actually just fun too, by the way. But J.K. Rowling I can't remember who it was. It was Piers Morgan, I think she said, when the Australian comedian, I can't remember his name, the Australian comedian told Piers Morgan to fuck off on live television. I think J.K. Rowling wrote, she just said something like that felt so good, and I think that's what it is. We can get right into that, but as change makers and as people who are, doing things to try and improve the lot of our society and the community to help people, as a helper or being in the helping profession, you can absolutely get caught in that idea of always being nice, always being kind. It's not to say you shouldn't never be. It's just judiciously decide who deserves your warmth, who deserves your kindness.
That was brilliant. Thank you. And that's really, really great advice. And I guess, ultimately it comes back down to maybe, being, taking away those masks and being completely honest about how you're, feeling about yourself and others, and letting go of maybe some of that fear of not being liked, as you say, particularly for the change makers. Now, I'm so sorry. So I'm having issues with my chat box. So Matt, I might just get you to, I know we're a little bit over time, but I might just ask you to take a look at the chat box and see if we've got any questions that you'd like to respond to.
I'll type there right now.
Okay.
To see if there's any questions.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So I know we've run out of Sorry, Matt. So we have run out of time today, and hopefully we'll have many more catch-ups with Matt. I found everything really, really amazing. I loved hearing your views and the research. And I look forward to your next book coming out as well, which I know that you're working on the topic of masks. Our next session will be tomorrow with Dr. Danielle Logue from UTS, which will be facilitated by Dr. Sally Curtis and Dr. Gillian McAllister. And interestingly, they will be talking about hybrid enterprises and how to manage them, drawing upon a 2-year research partnership between UTS Business School and the Wayside Chapel. So very interesting about the sequence of the events, which are completely a coincidence. But thank you so much, Matt. Is there anything that you wanted to add as sort of final takeaways for us to ponder on over the next few hours, days, weeks, years before we catch up again?
Everyone try and get out for a walk every day. I think over the next few months it's going to be really important just to walk and talk.
Brilliant. I love that. And also, how can we get engaged with the work of the NOFFS Foundation and Street Universities?
We're just updating our website right now. It's been pretty old and needs a serious reboot. So we're just rebooting that now, but you're very welcome to go there and get in touch with us there.
Brilliant.
NOFFS.org.au, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt, for your time, for being a part of SICON. I'm so humbled and so honored to have had the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and thank you also to our partners, the Australian National University and ACT government. Have a wonderful afternoon, and take care, and go out for that walk. Thanks again, Matt.
Thanks, Nazia. See ya.
See you soon. Take care.